Hello, you're listening to Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh. Today's episode is the second part of my conversation with Joe Steele, a friend and colleague who has a book out called Forbidden Love, the true love story of a black priest and white nun who defied the church and society, written by Lisa Jones Gentry as told by their son Joe. In the last episode, Joe and I talked about his early life with the family who raised him, coming of age as a young mixed-race gay man, and about how he left the corporate sector to become an independent consultant, which is how I know him. At the end, he talked about reconnecting with his birth mother, and in today's episode, we get into that more. Initially, my plan was to skim the book and ask him to tell the story as we spoke. It turns out that I'm hopeless at skimming when something is as interesting as Joe's story. So for context, his biological parents met when they were placed in the same parish in upstate New York. William was a priest and Sophie was a nun. They fell in love, and she left the order so that they could be together in secret. As an interracial couple, they had to meet over the border in Canada to be together. She conceived Joe and gave birth to him in secret in Ohio, where he was adopted and grew up. William and Sophie did find a way to be together for a few years before William passed away in 1964. I have to say that Joe's story is just incredible, and I hope that you appreciate this conversation as much as I did. So I told you when we spoke last week that I wasn't planning to read the whole book. And then last night, actually this morning at about 1:30 when I couldn't sleep, I was making some notes for when we were going to talk today. And I opened the book and I was just planning to flip through it and I read the whole thing. So
you're a quick read. I love it. You said you could read it quickly and you're not lying.
PhD superpower. Like, it's a remnant of the book a day diet. And it's a hard way to read books because I can't put them down until I finish them. And it's an incredible story, Joe. It really is. And I saw how in the narration you focused it on a few days that you spent with her when she was in hospital. Mm-hmm. I'm so curious, what prompted you to reach out to her and what was it like? What did you know about their story before you reached out to her? How did this unfold for you? I also didn't know, you were very young when your adoptive father passed. That's an experience we share. I lost my mother at 3.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that, Lena. Wow.
And that was before I was old enough to form really anything except snapshot memories of her. Mm-hmm. So I really resonated with those aspects of your experience. So I'm just curious how this unfolded, like you reaching out to her and coming to know about their story and all of that.
Through my adopted brother, Billy, because long story short, when my adopted father died, so I'm 5, I come into the house at 2. I was starting to have a bit more than snapshot memories. I was able to have a 5-year-old video clips of my birth father at that point, right?
Yeah.
So, and both in terms of my relationship with him and also my brother's relationship to him, because my brother's 10 years older than me. And so a lot of the snapshots are when my mother's a big bingo player. So when she would be at bingo or there was just something the boys were going to do, my dad and my brother were very close. They would have me tagging along as a little kid. So there were these vivid memories. So my father died in my brother's arms with me standing there, with just 3 of us because my mother was a bingo. So that memory was so seared in my mind. And then over the next year and a half, before my brother ended up volunteering, no less, that's a whole other story of going to Vietnam at the age of 16, my mother and my brother would argue a lot because, he was dealing with the loss of his dad, who he loved, dealing with now having to step in and be, the man of the family at 15, 16 years old, having his whole adolescence, shot in many ways because he went from being the cat's meow, because my brother he's Sagittarius, super sociable, drop dead gorgeous, and was living his life as an adolescent. And now all of a sudden he's thrust into all of his roles and responsibilities. And dad had died in his arms, so he was a bit to be tied. In that process, my brother found his adoption records by accident.
Oh, wow.
They had never told him he was adopted. So all this stuff just took my brother out. And one of the refrains, because it seemed like this was happening every Saturday morning in our kitchen, him and my mother arguing, he would say to her, "Don't you let that happen to Joe. Don't you let that happen to Joe." So I didn't know what they were talking about.
The finding out by accident, presumably.
Well, or that he was adopted,
Oh.
right? Because my family was sort of old school, right? So I say all that to say, my mother never actually said anything to me, this is my adopted mother, about me being adopted. I figured that out when I was 8 years old because he had written a letter home, and I was a nosy, precocious child. I had traitor's ears even at that point. And so he written a letter saying, "Look, I'm going to tell Joe if you don't tell him when I come home, for leave." I mean, he never actually said anything to me until I was a teenager. But the point is, I recalled how him and my mother, he was like an 8-year-old. I mean, I had at least enough sense to know. And my mother's Libra, like I said before, so you don't rock her world if you don't want yours rocked, right? She hadn't said anything to me, and she didn't say anything to me based on his letter, right? And he never said anything. So we basically went on sort of her knowing I knew, because my mother, they adopted me in their late 50s. So at this point, you got a woman in her 60s with a 5-year-old.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Out, doing day work to make ends meet. I mean, anyone who could do the math could figure out she wasn't my birth mother, right? And kids would make the comment, "Who's your grandmother? Who's your grandmother?" Yet she never said a word to me about being adopted, let know who my adopted parents actually might be, right? Because she didn't even know those facts.
Right.
So fast forward, because I never had any desire to find my birth parents because of the tension that existed for so long between my mother and my brother. And I was just so thankful what my mother was able to pull off. And I, maybe innately, my survival skill was, look, this woman is doing the best thing she can do to get me educated, to keep a roof over our head. And I'm not about to rock this world in any way that I don't need to, right? So any curiosity, if it was there, it was heavily suppressed. So fast forward, my brother's curiosity was piqued because he was so angry at her. He wanted to know who his birth family was. So he was on the quest for a long time. And then it turns out that the Ohio law changed. The change of the law was that adoptions that happened before 1964 were now going to be open. The closed adoptions were going to be open. So he ended up, and this all happened in the early 90s, so he ended up getting his files open, which is a whole story in itself. And he calls me one day and says, the social worker, because we were both adopted through Catholic Charities, happened to have my files as well, since we were part of the same family. And here's her information. Contact her, and you can get, my brother's at Sagittarius, right? He's directive. He didn't just, suggest something, right? He's like, call her in the next 2 weeks and get your information. And I'm like, no, because my mother was still alive at that point. No, I can't do that. I don't, I'm not that interested. I don't want to get her mad and upset. And blah, blah, blah. He's like, you got 2 weeks. If not, I'm going to pretend I'm you. I'm going to send the notarized letter and get your files. Which he would have done. My brother is like that, right?
Right.
So I was like, okay. I was definitely in that adoption camp of, even though it was suppressed, why was I put up for adoption? That question I still wanted answered, right? I mean, that was still on my mind, right? And so I'm like, okay, if nothing else, let me get the files. Maybe that might, be made apparent. And then when the files opened, because that whole priest-nun piece was not in the files.
I can imagine.
Right, that was not, particularly in Catholic Charities files, that was not documented, right?
Sure.
And so it turns out that the address for my birth mother that she had listed when she was, my birth father had arranged to send her from Buffalo to Cincinnati to give birth to me. Because at that point, she had left the convent since their relationship was moving in other directions. And she couldn't be a nun. He really, as a black man, wasn't in a position to leave the priesthood. So she moved back in with her parents, because their parents lived sort of close by to where the church was that they met up, because this is all up around Buffalo. And so she moved back with her parents. So the address in the files was her parents' address. Okay, this goes back to the 50s. Now you fast forward to the early 1990s. She had inherited the house. Her parents had passed away. She still kept the house. So she was still living at that address. And so literally it was just a matter of back then you called information to get phone numbers. I called information, gave them the name and the address. And so my files got opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. And by 1 o'clock in the same day, I was on the phone with her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it was so, did you ever see the movie Secret and Lies?
I didn't.
Okay. But anyway, there's a scene, because this is an adoption story, a mixed race adoption story, a British film. And anyway, there's a scene in there where she's on the phone for the first time with her birth mother. And I felt that scene so pronounced because, and particularly the whole scene is about letting the person know that you're actually their biological child. And the person on the other end, really denying any existence of knowledge about that. And so this must have went on, it seemed like eternity with my birth mother. Now, mind you, it probably only went on for 5 minutes where she was like, I don't know. Because the other freaky thing in this 5-minute experience, my birth name is my adopted brother's name. My adopted brother's name is William Joseph.
Okay.
My birth name is William Joseph. So I'm saying William Joseph. Now my adopted brother Billy's all in my mind because that's his name, right? And I'm like,
wow.
it was just the freakiest thing, Lena.
Yeah.
And it went on probably for 5 minutes of and he had coached me around how to be in the call because he had already done it. Stay focused on health. You don't want anything, just health information, blah, 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 blah.
Oh, wow.
And so finally, after about 5 minutes of her denying any knowledge about a William Joseph, she finally said, I'm Sophie. And then we both broke out in tears, and all that. And then in that first call, she answered that question that it pondered me, right? Why they put me up for adoption. So she very briefly started telling me the story about, so their relationship, both, the priest-nun aspect of it, and then also the racial elements of it too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because she's first generation Polish, and then he's mixed race himself. He's black and Irish, but back in that day, he was a black man. I mean, phenotypically and how he was being treated. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah. And like I said, I didn't come out to her until we actually met, which was like 6 months later.
Okay.
But we proceeded to have probably 2 or 3 times a month conversations on the phone, getting to know each other. And that was a trip, too. I mean, not from a gay perspective as much from a racial perspective, because, and this is something that went through the life of our relationship, and I had to keep on reminding her, is she kept on apologizing around the fact that I ended up being raised by a black family.
Huh.
Right. And I had to keep on reminding her that, first of all, some of it was out of love because, I mean, again, back to being a man, I can't imagine what it would have been like to give up a child, right?
Right.
Because that was a freaky thing all along too early on, is she had this instantaneous comfort with me and familiarity that initially was off-putting, and I had to keep on reminding myself, this woman gave birth to me, so she got connected at that point. I'm just getting connected now, but it really threw me off. The racial stuff, though, that she and I had ongoing conversations because she was so contaminated with her whole racial identity, being working class Polish up in Buffalo and all the stuff that goes with that.
Right.
Even though she had this long-term relationship, 5-6 years relationship with my birth father, she still felt like for some reason I had gotten a lesser than experience because I was raised by a black family. And I had to constantly remind her that, first of all, this black family saved her.
Right.
And saved her from something that she was not in a position to do. She couldn't have raised me. I mean, I probably wouldn't be here if she had raised me. Mixed race child in a Polish world,
right,
with an ex-nun, that wouldn't have been a pretty picture. So, and finally, I think I got her to the point of giving thanks to my family and this black family around what they had not only done for her because of me, and then also how they had actually affirm my identity as opposed to leaving me in this. If a child had a drop of black blood, the only family welcoming them for the most part was the black side.
Right.
Right. It was rare that you had the white side welcoming not only the child, but the child's mother and everybody else, right? Or father. So that became a lot. That's why, I mean, that was the other reason why, I'd already picked up that racial aspect of how she was dealing with race just in our phone conversations. That's why when I went to meet her in person, I had decided already, look, I'm going to let her know in the first visit that I'm gay. Mm-hmm. I don't want no issues with this. Or we can just be thankful we met and just call it a day. Right? So, and unfortunately, like, as you can see in the book, I mean, that wasn't the case. We had a phenomenal relationship. Yeah.
So in the book, you chart the course of their relationship, and it sounds like what happened was that she entered the convent very early in life and fell in love with your father, and they got together, they had this affair, and then when he passed, that was kind of it for her.
It was. Because she entered at 14, and she went into a Polish-speaking order. Because she grew up speaking Polish, because she's first generation, but in their household, her parents are both from Poland, and that's what they spoke. They had Polish borders and blah, blah, blah. So she actually had an accent, even as a first generation. And so she went into a Polish religious order at 14, and she ended up coming to that mission parish, because back then, the Catholic Church was segregated. So you had the various ethnic groups with their parish, and then you had what was called a mission parish for Black and Latino folks. As Catholics were doing their, conversion and all that. So my father was relegated to the mission parish, and this would have been in the early 50s. Because her previous life had been primarily, again, she was a nursery school teacher, so working in schools in Pennsylvania, in Canada, in New York as well. And so in the 50s, so now she's at this point, she's in her early 30s. She was placed at, it's called the Queen of All Saints. It's a mission parish in Lackawanna, New York, right outside Buffalo. So the reason that she ended up there was, I'm talking about just the craziness of the Catholic Church and their lack of cultural sensitivities. She was placed there because at that point in time, the steel mills along the lake, I think is that Lake Erie? Whatever that big lake is right there in Buffalo. The steel mills needed workers. So there were quite a bit of both black folks out of the South and then Puerto Ricans were coming to this area to settle and get these jobs, right? So Puerto Rican and black, you were going to be assigned to the mission parish, right, if you're going to be Catholic.
Right.
So the reason she ended up there is because there were a large number of Puerto Ricans with kids who were coming to this school. And so the Catholic Church, at least the Diocese of Buffalo, figured she's Polish speaking, which is, English as a second language. The kids are Spanish speaking, English as a second language. She should be able to work with these kids because she's got, she knows how to work with English as a second language.
Right. Okay.
Right? I mean, just from that, right, exactly. And they were probably able to get them on the dime as far as the nuns, right? I mean, in terms of not paying them anything. So anyway, that's how she ended up there. And then he, was assigned there because he's black, and, they were just trying to, put a black face on the parish as well. Which, as a total aside, this man is my father, was ordained at the Vatican, has a master's in theology, was, part of the Buffalo Soldiers as a major chaplain in Europe during World War II. I mean, credentialed in phenomenal ways, and this is sort of where he's relegated to.
Right.
Is this mission parish in the outskirts of Buffalo, New York. So he's there, and Sophie, because again, this is mortal sin, their relationship, go to hell type sin in Catholicism. And they both, I think, offered each other another opportunity to explore something that they would have never had the opportunity in their lifetime if it hadn't been that point in time, and something that they were very open to and actually needed.
Right.
Which really blossomed into a phenomenal love story that was still able to hold all the complexities of their religious beliefs and everything else. So I'm just really thankful about that aspect of their relationship, is sort of what they both allowed each other to have. Because I just recently got a photo of that, with the book out. I'm finding these cousins and stuff because he.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And particularly on his side, because he was raised by his Irish mother. So he was actually raised as the oldest of she ended up having kids that lived 8 or 9 kids. So he was the oldest mixed race kid, and she was at that point married to a German guy. So they're all white. So he's mixed race in an all white household. I look white and raised in an all black world. So I mean, the juxtapositions. But in any event, one of my white cousins on his family side, on his Irish mother's side, sent me a picture of him from 1950. This is my birth father. And it's really sad because he's sitting there with the graduating class. It's probably 8th graders, graduating class of 8th graders, as the priest there. And he was actually assistant pastor at that point. And he just looks distant. and just not super happy. And I guess the thing I'm sort of sharing with you with this is I'm just so happy. Well, first of all, I wouldn't be in this world if it wasn't for their relationship. But the fact that, he was open enough and she was open enough to bring a level of happiness in both their lives that they probably would have never experienced if it hadn't been that point in time and that level of just love that just sort of blossomed between the two of them. Because it's so clear, the way she talks about their relationship is how much love and happiness they had. And then looking at that photo, I could see that was really missing in his life. At least that's my sense, right? And, and their active involvement in just making sure that within the powers that they could, without letting anybody know that I was actually their child, and particularly him, of just, making sure I got placed. So, and also I want to just give while we're on this conversation, give a shout out to Canada, because Canada is what allowed their relationship to happen. Because once they started the intimate elements of their relationship, they had to go to Canada to actually be together.
There was a point where she left the convent while they were involved.
Right. It's so wild, this piece, Lena. You can appreciate this because in the book tours, the white women will often say, well, she had to leave her career. Why didn't he leave his career?
Right.
And it's like, okay, let's start with not to discount what she was doing because she was a nursery school teacher. At the end of the day, that was a very sexist world, and it wasn't really a career she had per se. I mean, she got into the convent trying to get out of the house she was living in, particularly the boarders that were in that house. And then my father, what is he going to do as a black man, a former priest, having none of his credentialing recognized, right? I mean, and then, so what was he going to do? So I think the whole notion of that he forced, because she left the convent because, well, two things. One is what is true. It's her excuse to get out of the convent. Her father had ailing health, and she was the only daughter, and back to sexism, right? I mean, there were two brothers, but, she's still the one responsible, right? To help out her mom. And then the other piece was it freed her up to explore what could be the possibilities in the relationship with my father, right? So that's why she left the convent. And then in the process, it did blossom, the relationship. I mean, he continued to want to take the risk, and then, she continued to sort of be interested. And again, Canada was where they would have to go just to be intimate with one another, because in Buffalo, New York, where's a mixed race couple going to go?
Right. So they literally crossed the border so that they could spend time together.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
And she managed to hide that from her family. Needless to say, in fact, even her pregnancy, because I asked her, how'd you manage to hide your pregnancy? Because at that point, she'd gotten a job. She's a hustling soul, and it's a working class family, too. So she got a job in a glass factory. And she managed to hide her pregnancy by wearing a girdle and then also wearing, really baggy tops.
Wow. Okay.
And then, and this is a little funny aside. The only way her mom figured out that she might be pregnant is her feet swelled during her pregnancy. And so her mom started making comments about her feet swelling. And so Sophie could think quickly on her feet, literally and figuratively. So she tells her mother, it's because I'm standing all day at the glass factory. And so her mother says, okay, well, yeah, I hear you. And that's generally something that happens to women who are pregnant. And so Sophie tells her mother, well, I mean, I'm a former nun. And in fact, I hope to go back to the convent, so I don't know what you're talking about, because I wouldn't know anything about that.
Wow. So did she manage to throw her mother off? They never found out? Oh, wow.
Nope, her mother never found out, because when she was 7 months pregnant, my father, through his connections, and also my father's from Cleveland, but had connections in other parts of Ohio too, and his sister was also down in Cincinnati, because one of his sisters is a nun as well. So he arranged for her as a unwed mother in the parish to go to a home for women to give birth to me in Cincinnati. So he got her out of Buffalo by the 7th month. Yeah.
Wow.
Now, mind you, though, I mean, she's an unwed woman, and at this point, Sophie was actually 37 years old. So you're talking about a woman later in life in terms of being, particularly back in those days, being pregnant. And again, when you went in at 14, she didn't have any baseline knowledge about anything from a physiological standpoint related to this, right? So my father had some level of knowledge because the parish that basically supported them had also there in Lackawanna, so, the suburb of New York where they all met, had a home for unwed women. Because he couldn't send her there because that was like in her backyard. So that's why.
Right.
But he did work at this particular home, so he had some baseline knowledge about it. But again, he's a man, so his baseline knowledge is going to be limited, right? So she pretty much dealt with all this by herself because she couldn't tell her mother anything like that, or anybody else she knew. So,
wow.
And then
Wow.
her gynecologist, who she was going to, she didn't divulge who the father was. And the way she got treated there was, you're just a unwed pregnant woman who made a mistake. So there was no love and care in terms of her being able to ask him questions and things of that nature.
Right. Yeah, that must have been just so immensely hard.
No, it was very immensely hard for her. Very immensely. I mean, it was to the point that when she was telling the story around when her water broke, because at this point she was in the home for the unwed women, and she didn't know what was going on. She just thought she was uncontrollably urinating. So
Right.
she had to literally knock on the woman's door to ask her what was going on. And she's like, no, you're about to give birth. You got to go to the hospital.
Wow.
So, I mean.
And then there was some complication around disclosing the race of the father.
Well, Sophie at least had the wherewithal to know, because at this point she didn't know what the baby was going to look like. In fact, I think she still felt like I was light enough, and why did I stay in the black world? I mean,
Right,
the
right.
conversation she and I had subsequently. But at that point, she didn't know what the baby was going to look like. So, I mean, she wanted to say white, and then was scared to death that, the baby wasn't going to come out white. So, so that's when she started going back and forth of making up, and then finally saying that the child's father, I think it's Negro finally, but I think she came up with Latino and all this other stuff. Again, because she had some level of exposure to the Latin community, particularly the Puerto Rican community, working at that school. So she came up. I think the book said Mexican, but technically they were Puerto Rican. So she started making up things about that. And the only reason that, because it is in my files that this child's father's Negro, my birth father actually came to visit Sophie. So he came down from Buffalo to Cincinnati to visit her right after she gave birth to me. In fact, it was probably the only time he laid eyes on me. And while he had done it in the disguise of being a priest concerned about a parishioner, since he had sent her down there, there were people at the hospital, again, talking about trader's ears. And again, and it just couldn't fathom this black man would care enough just as a parishioner. That it ended up getting into my records through the Monsignor, no less. Like, they never came at my father directly, but the Monsignor of Catholic Charities in Cincinnati wrote into the records that this child's father's Negro.
Did they figure it was him?
No, because that never came out. That never came out.
Wow.
I mean, because some of that could have just been priest to priest stuff. Because, I mean, the priests back then even were so notorious with having children. Right? I mean, so that wasn't like out of the ordinary, but they would at least have to let you know that this child's black. I mean, that was probably more important than even saying he was a priest. That, let's just be clear, no families adopted no black child.
Wow. And then after Sophie had you, they were able to find a way to be together until your birth father passed.
Right, yeah. Which, again, getting back to sort of, particularly white women, asking, Sophie left her career and then she became a housekeeper. My father did actually try to consider leaving the parish, and that, and this isn't clear in the book, but there's a screenplay out now, and fortunately it's clear in the screenplay.
Is there really a screenplay out? I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, it turns out the writer of the book, Lisa Jones Gentry, she's a screenplay writer for TV shows.
Amazing.
And so she's part of the guild and blah, blah, blah. And this is a blessing during COVID, because she was able to write it on spec for herself, because there's generally requirements around what you get paid.
Sure.
But she did a spec for herself, and bang up job. And so she was able to tell this piece, because he did actually try to get a job, right? So he was going to leave the church, and an elementary school teacher working at like a Woolworths. And again, back to just racism toward black men. I mean, we're talking about 1957. I mean, he finally got a job offer in Canada. And I forget exactly what it was, back to Canada. And it would have required him to move, I forget, Saskatchewan or one of these provinces out west. And And at that point, Sophie's father was still quite ill, and
Right.
Sophie didn't want to make the move.
Yeah.
And so all this at the same time is because up until this point, he was assistant pastor. And at the same time, the pastor actually left the church. And so again, church, mission, parish, trying to save money, didn't hire another pastor. They moved my father into assistant pastor by himself, like with no other support, just by himself. But that worked at their advantage. So now he was in the rectory by himself. And so that's how that unfolded. So he's like, part of the deal in the rectory was there was a live-in housekeeper. That was part of the budget, and that was part of what he had. So the person that was there, because of her age and also her relationship was more with the pastor. So once he left, she decided she was going to leave as well. And so since the budget allowed a housekeeper, he approached Sophie about this option.
Wow.
And so she went with it. So they lived together, from 1958 till 64 when he died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so.
Wow. And then what did she do after?
She went back to her family's home, and, at that point, she was, well, first of all, already ensconced in a relationship. So it was, just to switch gears and go back to being a nun. That was just out the question. And and she actually wanted to hold on to those memories. Every time I talk to Sophie, her love for my father and the happiness they gave each other and her lack of any regret. I never heard her express a regret. That's what always shocked me. I would have thought, well, oh my God, my life could have been different. None. So I'm just sort of saying she had created such a different life that past life she had no interest in revisiting. Along with the fact of, like I said, her father was still ailing because he hadn't passed away yet. So that piece was there and still alive. And she had gotten a new life. Because when you're 14 and you're thrust into being a nun, you really are robbed of your whole adolescence and young adult development.
Sure.
And she had finally gotten that in her later years of life. And then what she decided to do, though, is since that was her story, I'm a former nun, that's how her family knew her, because she still had one of the brothers, she still had two brothers alive. One subsequently passed away after all this, but she's really close to her brothers, the only girl, so she's really close to her brothers and her family. And she just sort of liked that life, and she sort of felt like she had the love of her life. That was enough for her in this lifetime. And she just opted to just sort of live that life of a former nun. Never divulged the fact that she had this relationship or anything about me. So that was a big issue too, is when we finally did meet, we get together, it would pretty much have to be confined to her apartment because there was no one knew about me, and she wanted to keep that way. And that was actually the case. There was one exception that got messy where, someone found out. But otherwise, the rest of the family didn't know me until I was at her funeral, and she had made me the executor on her estate. What she had. And then that's where it came out, because I'm the darkest person there running the whole funeral arrangement situation. And one of the cousins, my first cousin, we've still not spoken to this day, is like staring me down with a passion, and not lovingly, right? Just staring me down as I'm interacting with the funeral director, etc. And so I said, okay, I just need to tell this guy because I'm uncomfortable. I don't want other people to start getting uncomfortable with his behavior. So I asked him to come into like one of these little rooms off where, the wake was happening. Went into the room and I said, just want to let you know, your auntie had a relationship, and I'm, the product of that relationship, and we've been having a relationship, and that's why I'm in the role I'm serving here today at the funeral. He just looked at me and said, okay, and walked out and never spoke to me again in life.
Wow.
Which I think, as an aside, Lena, it made me even more thankful about having been raised by Black folks. It's such a different culture. This Polish culture, at least the culture she came out of, are the most, especially the men, are the most emotionless folks. I would have just been an emotional desert, if I had been raised in that culture.
So you were thankful that you weren't. Oh yeah.
Beyond.
Wow.
Well, even from the time I met her, it just reaffirmed that she had made not only, and I think I gave that to her too. I reaffirmed to her that she made the best decision both for me and her. Choice. Right? You made the right choice, and please don't feel any guilt about it.
Yeah.
That's easier said than done because it was clearly still something on her mind. But I constantly reaffirmed to her that she made the right choice for both of us.
Right.
Yeah.
My jaw was dropped when you were describing how how the funeral was the first time that anybody else in the family found out about you.
Oh, believe me, it was the wildest experience because, first of all, there wasn't a whole lot of people there because Sophie was very, very private, and her family
Sure.
at that point, a lot of them had passed away. But in terms of just her social network of people she knew, 'cause she lived, well, she was at a nursing home at this point, but a lot of her time had been spent in a senior citizen facility. So she knew a few people there, and then people from the nursing home, and a few family members, and then people in the room were looking at me, and then looking at her, and then looking back at me, looking at her, and there are like some. I mean, if you have to look, but there are some similarities, right?
Right.
The whole thing was just the weirdest thing. That's why I felt like with him, I had to tell him what
Wow,
was supposed to
Joe.
be.
Wow.
Because he would have been the person who would have been the executor on everything and handling the funeral and everything else. So the fact that he wasn't in that role and I was in that role, and he never met me and didn't know me from Adam.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And his wife was just as nasty. I saw them the next day, at the funeral. I mean, they didn't even come up to me and speak.
Wow.
No, it was like, y'all are some cold-blooded folks.
Do you think there was like, did you sense or feel that there was an undertone of racism there as well?
Oh, please, of course.
Yeah.
I definitely felt that. And who knows? I mean, I was by myself. I wasn't there with the wife.
Right.
Glenn, I didn't want Glenn to go partake in that dynamics. I mean, he knew Sophie, and, they really got along well, but he didn't know any of these strangers, just like I didn't know any of them. And I didn't want to overlay our relationship and gayness on top of the complexities of this situation. And then and race was overpowering. Yeah, because I clearly was the darkest one there. And I'm pretty light skinned. And I was definitely the darkest one there.
Oh, wow, Joe.
Yeah.
Just wow.
So now, on the flip side, she had a friend. Back to, I think, how women and men are just different from an emotional standpoint and being able to handle the complexities. A woman named Dorothy, Scorpio. And so as Sophie got sicker and ultimately needed to be put into a nursing home, I was relying on Dorothy because Dorothy was the only person my mother really had a deeper relationship with, because Dorothy spoke Polish, felt comfortable talking Polish. Sophie still liked to talk in Polish. And then also Dorothy knew how to keep her mouth shut, just in general. So Sophie came to trust Dorothy, right? So now, she never told her about who I was, right? Never told Dorothy. And so as Sophie got sicker and was at the hospital, not the hospital, the nursing home, and I needed to get information, and I wasn't there. I told Sophie, look, Sophie, you're going to have to tell Dorothy that I'm your son. So that she knows, because I was already in conversation with Dorothy, but I hadn't told her who I was, right? Now, this Scorpio had already figured things out, right? So I'm up in Buffalo, and so I'm at the nursing home. So I tell Sophie, have you told Dorothy yet our relationship? She's like, no, not yet, right? And I'm like, Sophie, you've got to tell Dorothy because I'm relying on her and I want her to know. She, blah, 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 blah. She's like, okay, well, what should I tell her? And when Sophie wanted to feign like she couldn't figure it out in English, she would ask me to write things down, right? When she claimed she couldn't understand. So she couldn't understand what I was asking her to tell Dorothy, right? So I took this pad of paper and I wrote down, Joe is my biological son. Okay? And so by pure coincidence, Dorothy came to visit Sophie that day. So I stepped away to give them the time for her to tell Dorothy who I was and for me to be able to come back and have this conversation with Sophie to see if she had done it, right? Okay. And so I went back, and Dorothy had left. I went back, and so I said, Sophie, did you tell Dorothy? She's like, yes, I told Dorothy. I'm like, okay. So I called Dorothy the next day and said, Dorothy, did Sophie tell you about our relationship? And Dorothy tells me she handed me the piece of paper.
Amazing. And that was the conversation.
That was the conversation.
Wow.
And then Dorothy was like, look, I had figured this out. I didn't know that you were her birth son because, I saw her as a former nun and things, she said, but I knew that there was something going on because Sophie was just not one to trust somebody. So this was more than just a friend. So, yeah.
Right.
And she was very, very instrumental in also me keeping my composure together and also being able to grieve my loss at that funeral because she was able to come over and talk to me, that understanding, I mean, and pull me aside. And so I guess I was, forever indebted to Dorothy.
You had an ally.
I had an ally. I mean, in a very, very challenging time because, grieving the loss of me, of my birth mother now. I mean, while it was very different than grieving the loss of my adopted mother, because my adopted mother passed away back a few years after I met Sophie, but which I'm pleased that I was able to at least have met Sophie prior to her passing because I was able to reaffirm to her that she's mama to me, right? That's who my mama is, right? And that Libra, she was wild too because once I started getting a relationship with Sophie, I let her know, look, I met my birth mother, thinking she was going to tell me my adoption story, right? So her comment on my adopted mother was, "Oh, that's nice." Now, what else is going on?
Wow. Woman of few words, your mom sounds like.
Yes, it's taught me, though, Lena, how part of love is being aware of what you would like it to be and being accepting of how it actually shows up, right? Because my mother's love for me, I mean, both mothers, was unquestionably profound and deep. Now, it didn't manifest itself in ways that I may have liked it to. Yet, what I benefited from was love. So it really was it was an eye-opener to me around that whole element of how love can show up.
That's really clear in how you narrate it in your book. I was really touched by that.
So thank you.
So I guess I have one question about this experience you had getting to know your birth mother and your adoption story. And this goes back to how the theme of this series is identity. Did that change and impact anything about how you identify or how you show up in the world? I guess how did that impact your view of self?
Well, from a queer perspective, I'm trying that word on, Lena.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
From a queer perspective, it reaffirmed the journey I had been on up to the point of meeting my birth mother, that I do love self. I don't have to hide it from her. Now, and specifically, particularly for people who mean something to me. I mean, it's like I can come out to my birth mother, I can come out to pretty much anybody. Now, mind you, as a total aside, I still have to pick and choose of when I come out and don't. I think being a man, I think, gives me that power without a lot of pressure because I get asked and nowhere near the frequency of my female colleagues, are you married? Do you have children? And those type of things. So that still does happen. And do I share that? Don't share it, particularly with total strangers. With people who mean something to me, coming out to my birth mother freed me up to come out with anybody. So that was a liberating. I mean, people I care for, I mean. Because in some of the places I've been, and you can relate to this. So, but and with immediate family, friends, etc. Like I said, being out with your birth mother, I can be out with anybody, or being out with my two moms. So that's been a good news story. I think the thing that has also been eye-opening is from a racial identity perspective, because now that I've met my birth mother, who is white, Polish background, white, it's given me a lot more empathy for mixed race folks because. Before, being mixed race and having been raised in a black household, a light-skinned black household, so I'm definitely, knowledgeable about colorism and passing and all that kind of stuff. But it was hard for me to really be in relationship with mixed race folks who actually grew up with their white side because that wasn't my experience. Now, once I met my birth mother and then through the book, meeting, these cousins on both my father and mother's side, because since my father grew up in a white world too, it's given me a lot more empathy around what that experience is very different than mine, as opposed to, we're both mixed race, you should that shouldn't be as problematic for you type thing. Because not growing up with the white side, it wasn't as problematic for me because I was in an affirming black environment that looked just like me. So I definitely have grown with mixed race people immensely in being in a relationship, like I said, with my adoptive white side. I guess those are the two things, racial identity and also just an ease of like being out, the world doesn't stop when you come out. And then also if people really care for you, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Because, I've lost a few relationships having come out. And also I think that in being out, there is still a level of risk in it, right? So I just sort of say it because particularly, in terms of listeners on this call, coming out is such a personal decision in terms of coming out in the context of sharing that you're LGBTQ with someone else. So I am definitely totally against outing others or getting mad at people that they're not out the way I think they should be, or sharing their information before they've shared it with somebody else, even in the best of intentions. I am very, very cautious about what I share when people are querying me about other people's quote unquote family.
Right.
Particularly if I don't know what they've shared. So I just sort of say it because while I'm free and liberated, I realize that that's not the experience many folks have. And I guess, to bring this full circle, I can definitely accept that queer is an affirming word, particularly for the younger generation, and I respect that. We still live in a world that the safety's not there of being out. And again, having particularly worked a lot outside of the U.S.,
it's still a calculation we have to make,
which can have a significant impact on your actual safety, both psychologically and physically. Right. So I guess I say that to say, and maybe this is age too, from a being out perspective, I'm fortunate enough to be in my life where I can comfortably be out, and I'm not naive enough to expect that that's everybody's experience.
Absolutely.
And I think the only other thing I want to say while we're on this topic, because this is like a growth area for me, is because I've used this acronym several times in this conversation, LGBTQ plus, is it's only within the last year or so that I have really realized how much work I have to do from my cisgender place, right? Of like identifying, gender-wise in terms of gender I was born into. And just realizing what it means to be an ally in that perspective and to really do a lot more work in, first of all, just becoming more aware, right? And then also the work necessary. And this is what gets back to the intersectionalities of all this, because one of the things that I also have to work through and I'm working through is trying to realize that time does change and history changes. And on the flip side, sometimes I feel like some of these efforts often allude back to civil rights and what happened with race, right? And I realize that that's a real hot button of mine because it's not an either or, it's a both and. Right. And also part of allyship is to understand that. And then I think the other piece of allyship is to also acknowledge that experiences people have, we're not like one dimensional as people. No. We've got multiple aspects of our difference that can be playing out at the same time, right? And so I guess that's one of the things for me to also have some sensitivity on, particularly the gay community, the trans community, is really dealing with just this ongoing old-fashioned oppression and framing it at times in a civil rights Black perspective in terms of struggle and similar techniques, et cetera, in terms of fighting against it, while not acknowledging the racism and the sexism and the classism that still exist amongst the LGBTQ community. Right?
Absolutely.
So, and again, I think that that's probably work I can contribute. And I also realize it's work that I have to manage for my own self around my own hot buttons, given my life experience dealing with these dynamics.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, the complexities that you're speaking to right now, that's a lot of what motivated me to start this project, this podcast project, to actually sit and grapple with how complex those things really can be and are for a great many people whose perspectives are really hard to come across, So,
and there's power in numbers. So, and that's why I really appreciate you, Lena, for taking the time to have this conversation with me, putting the time into this podcast, because it's only by being in contact, in relationship,
Right.
do we figure out, what are our intersectionalities in terms of commonality, and ways that we can support each other while we can also have differences that can still be a struggle, right? And how to sort of, to your point, hold the complexities of that, because the more people you have as an ally in various ways, it may not necessarily always be the way you want it, the more support you're going to have. And I think the more equitable environment, particularly from an LGBTQ perspective, that we can continue to move the needle in terms of the equity piece. Because I don't know, you and I probably haven't had this conversation per se, because I'm a firm believer in inclusion and belonging. And this comment, just to close out, is probably going to sound generational too. I don't feel like we need to be the best of friends to like coexist and support each other. So I just sort of say it because my interest these days is more on the equity front, is to really, be an ally in terms of just what people want that I can possibly facilitate that results in fair and equitable treatment.
Right.
Right. And not that we have to agree on every aspect at the cultural level or even at the interpersonal level for that matter. But at the institutional level and just basic equity of just treating people with dignity and respect and equitable treatment in terms of rights, access, etc. That is a shared commonality, and that's sort of where my heart and head are now.
Right. Yeah. That's the thing that we need to agree on, and we can work from there.
There you go.
Yeah. Oh, Joe, I have to say, I had been eager to talk to you for a long time about this and many of the things that we touched on. And I'm really, really glad that we were able to have this conversation.
Ditto. And as always, I just, you're one of the easiest people I know to dance in a conversation and to go to the depths that you can take a conversation. So thank you.
Oh, I appreciate that, Joe. Thank you. And thank you for spending this time with me.
Oh, my pleasure.
You can learn more about Joe's book at forbiddenlovememoir.com. Read it. It is incredible. Queer Everything is going on a brief hiatus for the month of April while we record exciting new episodes. Follow us on social media to stay updated. Links are in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.